I think we can probably start.
Okay, thank you.
First, I will Jesse. If you I will just welcome the participants and give as mentioned in my email. So I will be very brief. I am welcome everybody. My name is Aurora Voiculescu. And I have the pleasure of welcoming and organizing this symposium, which is supposed to be, as it was mentioned earlier, a platform of interdisciplinarity that opens the space for discussion beyond the issues of technology. As we would have seen, there are other symposia as well aspiring for this, but our focus being the one of trying to see the extent to which the normative developments that need to take place in society in order to welcome artificial intelligence and robotics technologies are actually taking place, and to engage with the initiatives that are put forward from the various stakeholders. Now, today we can really cover only a very small part.
Also might change, so you can, the idea is to trace concepts throughout time, like the idea of what a robot is and what a robot can do is likely to actually change throughout time. And it is also very much about this process of object constitution, like how do robots become constituted as an object of governance? How are they made governable? Which kind of definitions are used so that the EU or other governmental organization can justify its governance? And I was going to explain a bit what we are looking at, but I'm already, I'm at 10 minutes already. So in the last 5 minutes, I was going to give a little bit of an insight. What I would like to do still, because Tech Talk gave us a free license as a researcher, and I promised them to kind of tell this at conferences. So we use Tech Talk to analyze our documents. So we give all kinds of labels. We give all kinds of labels to different statements, different narratives, and then later we, after that, the JSON files that come out of that are being analyzed in Tableau. But yeah, I think I will stop here because then there is still some time for questions. Yeah. So.
Thank you very much, Jesse. That's really very much appreciated, the way you summarized your presentation, unfortunately, given the shortage of time. I would suggest that actually we move on instead of taking questions now, so because some of the questions may be able to hint and to link to both presentations, although they cover different areas. I do have a couple of points of myself. To go on with giving Margarita the chance to have her 10 minutes now. Margarita, apologies again, of her presentation. Margarita Maxopoulo, she's based at King's College London and as a researcher, and she's going to talk to us about epistemic exploitation and contributory injustice in law and AR research, looking into paradigm changes in legal research regarding AI technology. Margarita, it's over to you if you want to share screen.
Sure. Just give me a moment.
And if you can, apologies again, if you can keep within 10 minutes, and we may have to chip into the break, the 10-minute break with the discussion. Hopefully we are not going to be booted out of the breakout room. Thank you.
Sure. So, hello everyone. And Aurora, thank you very much for your warm welcome. Jesse, your presentation was very interesting. Indeed, I do have a couple of points myself too for later. So I'm Margarita and I am a PhD in law candidate at King's College London. I am doing research in the intersection of AI and legal regulation. And I'm mostly interested, and if you want, I have familiarity mostly with the so-called socio-legal literature. So what I'm interested in doing is not if you want, mere doctrinal legal analysis in my PhD. What I'm doing is I'm actually interested in other factors out there that connect to social reality and how actually social actors perceive of certain things. So this is why in my PhD, I'm doing some interviews with people that are participating, if you want, in the AI regulation discourse. Now, this is just an introduction, just on an introductory note. Here today, I am having I have prepared a talk called Epistemic Exploitation and Contributory Injustice in Law and AI Research. So what is this about? Here I have three main sections for my presentation today. The first is actually that AI has come under the legal radar. And I'm wondering here, what do legal researchers, what do we do with AI? The second section, the second theme I'm going to talk about is the epistemic bubbles problem. And the third section is about the implications of these bubbles and the communicative dead ends that I seem to have been discovering on the ground. Now, just to start with, I'm sure that you have already dealt with some of these issues. I mean, all over we see literature arising around how we can deal with AI from a legal point of view. I mean, legal researchers have started to grapple with these issues. Some people have started studying AI definitions and what do we do with how we can define AI. Other people are mostly doing work in how how we can ensure current legal frameworks are adequate and effective on the ground. Others are talking about the potential implications to our societies, to our democracies and rule of laws, individual rights, and so on. We have also seen research regarding, legal tech, legal analytics, how AI is disrupting, if you want, the justice system. And in addition to that, we currently see multiple reports and studies coming both from the academic sector, the academia, but from policy bodies too, that have to do with how AI is starting to be incorporated in the public sector, how public officials what public officials can do in order to be able to know how to responsibly use AI data for them to be trained and so on. I'm also sure, that you have studied different approaches regarding policy making to what to do in the regard of, I mean, should we go for soft law instruments? Should we go for hard law instruments? And so on and so forth. However, I am currently studying, I have been discovering that most legal researchers seem to be feeling like they are swimming in the chaos. So there are so many, there are myriad problems that relate to AI applications. And indeed, actually most of the researchers actually follow their kind of gut feelings. And I mean, with respect to what to study, what to delve into, delve deeper into. And the thing is that legal researchers in particular kind of have deal with some particular challenges. I mean, legal education is kind of limited when it comes to methodology. So legal researchers tend to do research in a kind of doctrinal and in particular ways, and legal education lags behind in terms of interdisciplinarity. So most legal researchers are not familiar and I mean, in the best scenario and in the worst scenario, not open to interdisciplinary scholarship. The second thing is that legal researchers usually feel most familiar with nationally confined issues for them to actually discuss their national legal frameworks. And There are several other problems for them that relate to incentives, but I won't go deeper into that. I wanted to say that there are certain problems arising with this situation, exactly because in the legal realm, there is a lot of duplication of work when it comes to researching AI, exactly because everybody seem to be discovering everything from scratch. And this is quite, if you want, we want duplications of work in terms of definitions, in terms of the the most effective approaches to be adopted, and so on. So there is a need for priority setting. We need to do something about it. I mean, from the legal point of view and from the point of view of the legal researchers, exactly because our resources and time are not endless. Okay, so there is the thing that we should learn how we should prioritize among the myriad problems arising from the application of AI technology. And second, we should find out how to best work on these problems to do most good. I mean, surely there must be some most effective ways and some least effective ways. This literature is called meta-research into AI research. This has to do with our methodological and epistemological prerequisites. So I was particularly curious in exploring what are the pathways that we can go towards with regard to this research question. How do our perspectives and disciplinary training and worldviews as legal researchers influence and potentially, of course, limit or bias our capacity to produce research that is meaningful, that will meaningfully impact the future of AI? Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've done some empirical work with people that work with either legal researchers or computing science professionals working in the public sector or in the private sector, and have some experience with AI regulation, the discourse. They have either been, for example, members of policy committees, or they have been involved in efforts to operationalize a legal principle for the purposes of their environment. So in this context, I found out that there seemed to be a problem regarding our the bubbles that we seem to be operating into. The thing is that the communication between the computing science community and the legal community is very, very important. It's very crucial. I mean, this interaction is often the main communicative avenue through which legal principles are communicated to the computing science community. And of course, this is crucial for their how they can be, if you want, computed to an extent to actually put them into practice when it comes to AI applications. However, the thing is that this interaction is not really going very well in practice. Here I have some quotes from the interviews. Of course, there is a lot of text in this slide, but the main message from these quotes is that the legal mindset in general, both of the professionals and the legal researchers, are kind of portrayed in the data set as being very far away from the computing science professionals. And people, I mean, I have some, I've done some interviews with policy people as well, and these particular views come from policy environments. So they say that actually the legal profession is kind of closed. It's not very open to discussing alternative perspectives. There are some very entrenched structures in terms of the authority that the legal profession holds, and so on and so forth. And if you see this slide too, these quotes come from computing science professionals. They kind of feel that the two worlds are not really they do not really communicate in a meaningful way. So if you see the legal do legal and we do our thing, or the first quote is, if a team member tries to directly communicate a policy or a legal thing, they mean developer, that's a mess, and things like that. So the final quote says, legal people request non-actionable tasks. Legal people mostly see the big picture, but what is the definition of that big picture is not really clear. And the same view is held here for the regulators. So they have the big picture in mind, but how can we operationalize this in practice? We have no idea. The implications of these communicative dead ends now. The problem is that I'm currently I'm mapping two main things.
Yeah, yes. If you could aim to conclude so that we can have just a couple of minutes for questions.
Yes.
I'll forward this again.
Sure.
Finish your idea. Finish your idea.
Yes, just to close the presentation with that, these are the main themes that I'm currently mapping through in this project. So that there is these two trends, that members of one epistemic group require the other members of the epistemic group to actually educate them without a really proper consideration of this burden of the translation processes and what really this effort requires. And the second is that these members of one epistemic community hamper the ability of others to actually join the discussion, to contribute to this discussion, because the language that is used is actually kind of a jargon, if you want. It doesn't really allow other people to contribute to the knowledge. So in conclusion, I wanted to say that, of course, we have in research in particular, a tokenistic inclusion of of the views of these two epistemic communities to the other side's research work, and this does not really work in practice, not really, and doesn't really end up with a meaningful interaction between these two communities. And of course, we have some repercussions for a general democratic lawmaking, but this is a deeper discussion. I will leave this for the Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Margarita, and thank you to Jessie again, also both for the effort of fitting within some time, the available time. We open for a few questions, in maybe a couple of questions that we can take either aimed at both presenters or individually. If I'm trying to open to see the hands up, if you put, I can see we have a question that came, I believe, regarding epistemic communities. I don't know whether, Zoran, you wanted to ask that question, or it was just for the community as point of reflection? You need to unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm in abstract, I'm referring with this term to professional communities that share some kind of they have shared values, principles, and usually epistemic toolkits. So if you want, each discipline has a particular toolkit and a particular way in which they have learned how to think and how to do research, how to approach practical matters when they do research. So when we have these shared characteristics, this is what the community is and how I'm referring to the community in this way.
Thank you, Margarita. Other questions? Somebody may, yes, Daniel? Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you both for the presentations. I think my question is more aimed at Jessie, but Margarita, please feel free to add if you have any insights as well. I guess, Jessie, the first question is very specific. I guess I'm just curious because I don't know tag talk. So are you using, it's kind of a sentiment analysis and then to pull out various sentiments in the policy documents? And then that leads into a second question, which would be, are the documents that you're looking at only policies that are already passed through parliaments, or are they documents that are being developed? And then the third thing would be the idea of how do you address the various manifestations of robotics? Because, for instance, a healthcare robot is completely different than self-driving car, and then at the other extreme end of the spectrum is autonomous weapon systems, which various governments are developing. For instance, like the Airbus FCAS, which incorporates autonomous weapon systems as part of its plan for France, Germany, and Spain. So I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I'm just going to go through them fast. Tech Talk partly, but actually most of the work is still in manual analysis. So we have clicked on all of those sentences. We have selected them. We have had the process of reviewing each other's codes and stuff like that. We are using sentiment analysis afterwards, though. And the initial plan, the reason why we chose Tech Talk is because it is their slogan is something like, we want to democratize NLP, natural language processing. And we partly had the hope that we could really automate it, but it's going to be it's difficult. I did put in my future goals and ambitions, though I'm not going to share my screen now, but one of the points was automatic identification of treaties, laws, etc., in relation to specific issues. This is kind of working right now, but not perfect, where we try to Tech Talk to recognize that they talk about a specific treaty or law or whatever, which always have quite specific names, you know, like they always have the same structure. So machine learning can kind of work there, but still not perfectly. But one of the ambitions is that we connect those. So which treaties or laws are very often mentioned in relation to a certain issue. That's that. Then the policies, if they are already, no, they're definitely, because we are talking here about emerging technology, so to say, that like I think I emphasized that quite a bit in my presentation. So we are definitely also including policy proposals and things like that. There are also expert that they invite experts to talk about certain, to write a certain policy proposal. We explicitly have included those because we are interested in how this idea of the robot as a governance object is developing. So we actually want those ideas there. Then the last one is a bit related to that. So the different manifestations of robotics. The interesting thing is that we were first thinking of completely splitting that, but then we discovered that actually in quite some policy documents, they it seems that the authors themselves have quite a general idea of robots. Like also, like the definition of robots very often differs in different documents and even within documents. So we actually purposefully don't distinguish them so much, but we focus on shared features like autonomy, and so we specifically focus on such kind of statements where they talk about such kind of features like autonomy, intelligence, etc. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jesse. I'm afraid we have to stop here. Maybe we can continue in the chat with questions to the Jesse and Margarita, so that we can have 1 minute maybe off while my colleague Allison Gardner will take over chairing the next session. I think we remain, we do not move from this, those that are attending AIRoNOS. Well, I haven't been informed about our usual track for the AIRoNOS being open again. So we stay in this breakout room for the remaining until we are informed otherwise. Yes, so let's say we start shortly with the session, 2 o'clock session with Anna and Seda. We can take 1 minute off. Thank you.
I have the joy of trying to pronounce people's surnames. I don't even pronounce my own correctly half the time. as is immortalized in the front page of my PhD thesis many years ago, where the very first typo was my own name, and it's down as Alcyon instead of Allison. So I just, you know, that moment when you're flicking through just before your Viva and you just go, oh, really? Oh, right. So we're 1 minute past.
Yes, thanks for doing this, Alison. And
My-
I know that you had your own private technical challenges just half an hour before
Yes.
the symposium. It's telling again.
Yes, I've been
Okay.
currently paying some random person my £48 a year and not AISB, so somebody's doing well at me. Right, Anna, do we have you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, hello, Anna. Could you just pronounce your surname for me?
Yes, it's Hovsepian.
Okay, Hovsepian.
Yes.
Oh, I normally don't get it right. Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you for coming along today. I mean, your talk is entitled Algorithmic Accountability on Social Media Platforms, which I think is very apt, particularly within the UK with the Online Harms Bill white paper coming through. And the tagline is Digital Identity, Portability and Self-Regulation. So Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me then just share my screen. Just a second.
I'll give you a 1 minute warning, Anna.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, thank you.
So, well, first of all, I just wanted to thank you for organizing the convention. This is an incredible opportunity. I think all PhDs will agree with me in these extremely challenging times to share our work. And so as you can see, my title is Algorithmic Accountability on Social Media Platforms, Digital Identity Portability and Self-Regulation. Now, before starting my presentation, I just want to clarify one thing which is extremely crucial, is that despite that I will be mostly talking about self-regulation and digital identity portability, nevertheless, what is important to be highlighted here is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to AI problems. And I've recently found sometimes that the idea of generalized AI accountability that is often being used, it might be dangerous and might not be very effective. And I will explain what I mean by that. Though it is, again, understandable why there was a need for it at the very beginning in order to raise kind of awareness about AI accountability, but I would say that it's, as in Frank Pascal's new work as well, it's probably during the first wave of the but what I'm trying to say now is that we need to try to tackle the problem that are caused by algorithms in a more narrowed down way. And what I mean by this is that the issue is too complex, it is multi-layered, and despite companies that are often being referred as big tech companies under the same umbrella term, the mistake, the challenge and the threats that they possess are completely different. So if we're talking about Facebook and we're talking about Amazon, Apple, Google, or even Netflix, they possess completely different threats. And for that reason, even the paper will discuss on social media providers, how social media providers should be regulated. But again, I want to also, because I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. I'm a PhD candidate in law at King's College London. So I am a lawyer, and probably my perception is slightly different. And when I have been researching on accountability, I find even on social media platforms, when we're talking about free speech and Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act, those are very different problems from, for example, micro-targeting, behavioral modification, or privacy violations. Now, what I'm trying to say is that self-regulation does not mean no government regulation. This is also very important, because regulations like the GDPR are extremely important. But at the same time, it is a necessary element, self-regulation, that has been underestimated since the first wave of self-regulation has failed. And I'll try to explain what I mean by first wave of self-regulation. Now, moving forward, to regulate or not to regulate, and the discussion about regulating the internet can be probably summed up this way. But with the rise of new technologies, and in particular machine learning and this new era of surveillance capitalism, the interest and the need to regulate it has become the biggest priority. And the idealistic view of the internet as something that will self-regulate itself and will liberate democracies, societies worldwide, and will give us this access to public sphere with unlimited access to knowledge and information that used to look like a dream a few decades ago. But of course, with great new powers come great new responsibilities, and there has been a very legitimate concern about possible harms, whether intentional or unintentional, caused by those systems. As basically so far what we have experienced is that technologies, and this is probably about all kind of artifacts that we are talking about, they are being disruptive and destructive at the same time. And the words like the net delusion or surveillance capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, they have illustrated it very well. And also I want to highlight that, of course, there is the positive side of it, because I'm also researching, my current research is on AI and democracy. And of course, social media platforms have been used so far as well as an attempt to democratize societies. But the paradox and the double paradox that we see there is that while being used to democratize societies, right in the process of democratization, we have come across situations where bad actors figured out how to use the technology, and it actually, instead of democratizing, it might end up into gaining more authoritarian power and lead to more totalitarian governments. Now, I would like to move to the paper itself. So the first part of the paper, and because I have limited time, I will not be talking that much about the first part of the paper, but just very briefly. So the first part of the paper is divided into two sections, and I'm drawing parallels and comparisons with the historical examples of the breakup of the Bell system. And the reason why I'm doing this is that the Facebook antitrust case, which probably most of you will be familiar with, it just resembles concerns that were raised over the course of the 20th century over the AT&T corporation that gained so much power that the whole market was basically incapable of competing because of that monopoly. But things have changed after the US Department brought a lawsuit against AT&T, and there was the breakup of the Bell system. Not only that, other changes in the regulation as well, but this was a breaking point. And this brought competition back to the market. And of course, with greater competition, one can say that comes probably not 100%, but a greater security for consumers and users. Now, the second part of the second section of the first part, and if you find it interesting, I will be happy to share the full article. The second part draws parallels with financial institutions. And the reason why I'm doing this is that some companies and tech companies, they have just become too big to fail, and as a result, too big to jail. Now, this is a term that had an idea that was coined by Garrett in the context of financial crimes. And there have been lots of very interesting cases within financial institutions as well, which just illustrates very similar power in the hands of a corporation, that we can just see how to try to regulate that power. What I'm trying to argue there is, because of the legal personhood and etc., is that holding individuals accountable is a very necessary and important step that we need to try to pay more attention to. Now, moving towards the second part, and this is something that I'm really excited to share on digital identity portability and self-regulation. Now, I'm using this quote by Morozov, which I will just read the quote, which basically says that there is much to admire about Google, Twitter, and Facebook, but as they began to play an increasingly important role in mediating foreign policy, admiration is not a particularly helpful attitude for any policymaker. And of course, as I mentioned, with privacy and with new wave of authoritarian governments, that is indeed an issue. But the reason why I just included this quote here is because if the argument of holding accountable, for example, social media platforms, is the one that we don't need social media platforms, that probably this paper will not be very helpful. But what I'm saying is that the platform is there. And what we need to do is just we need to figure out how to regulate it. Now, why I'm talking about self-regulation as an important element, I'm highlighting here 3 reasons why I'm doing this. Is that first, the pace of innovation is extremely high, that no government regulation can ever keep up the same pace. And I'm saying this probably as a lawyer, and when you see how difficult it is to change the law, it is just, and when you see how fast is the pace, how quick is the pace of technological development, there is just this fear that only through a government regulation, it will not be possible to keep up the same pace. Now, secondly, despite all the concerns over the internet, it is arguably, but still an independent platform that provides greater access to information and communication. And it is important to be careful not to overregulate it as well. And finally, I would like to just put a quote, which I really liked, by Joanna J. Bryson, and I'm quoting here, is that absolutely every complex entity, cells, people, corporations, governments, religions, whatever, of course, they all self-regulate or they wouldn't persist. And indeed, the good governments and good governance make that self-regulation easier. Now, this is why—
Just give you 1 more minute, Anna, so that you have time for questions. Just 1 more minute so you have time for questions.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I thought it's 15 minutes, sure. So basically, the reason why self-regulation has failed is because there was no enough competition. And now I will just move the whole idea of digital identity portability. And this is just one example at least. When in January 2021, WhatsApp introduced its new privacy policy that left the users without an option to opt out. It took less than a week to witness the most significant digital migration from WhatsApp to Telegram and Signal. And I thought that this was an absolutely fascinating case. According to the UK Parliament's Home Affairs Committee, over the first 3 weeks of January, Signal gained 7.5 million users and Telegram 25 million users. And this is very interesting what happens right after that, because the downloads in the UK of WhatsApp, they fell from being number 8 to number 23rd. Suddenly, just within a few probably hours or days, what happened is that WhatsApp announced that they are actually postponing their privacy policy. So we can see that this fear of losing your users or consumers, however we want to use the term, it is actually something that can help and trigger self-regulation. Now, what Telegram did was very interesting. And what you see on the screen right now is a quote from Telegram that happened just within days. They said that starting today, everyone can bring their chat history, including video and documents, to Telegram. Now, this gave this very good flexibility. And why was this such an important tactic to undertake is, and this probably will be a little bit of a controversial statement, but I just want you to listen to the end, is that at some extent, our digital identity, which includes our accounts on Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Twitter, and other platforms, they have become to some extent our extensions. And I'm in no way trying to enter into, this is not an argument of Chalmers or Clark. This is a bit different. What I'm trying to say is that there is a greater attachment to our online accounts due to them being representations of our identity, personality. For some, it's like a diary and they have it for decades. Now, a very important case that I just want to, just a second, this will be probably the last part that I will just highlight. And this is an example also with communications provider. I don't know how many of you are familiar with porting authorization code, but porting authorization code was introduced in 2003. Basically what it did, it gave the users, the mobile providers, they are not allowed to reject their customers when they want to change the mobile provider. And the reason why this was done is because when the terms and conditions were unfair or the prices were extremely high, when users had their mobile number for example, decade or 2 decades, and they have been using it, they were willing to accept very unfair terms and conditions only in order because they just were too attached to the number. Now, what happened in 2003, it's basically what they said is that a user, a customer can just, it should be very quick, like it takes usually 5 to 10 minutes, can easily change the mobile provider and to move from one operator to a different operator. Now, just to briefly conclude, this is basically something that I want to introduce, that we need an updated version of data portability, which is more like a digital identity portability that will allow users to take the full account and to move that account to a different platform, and they will have an opportunity to choose the terms and conditions that they want. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry for being so quick.
No, you were right. You did have 15 minutes. I'm horrendously strict. But we started a couple of minutes late, so which I've forgotten about. There are actually questions, Anna, in the chat. So and I spotted one. If I can get it up, I've just lost it. So Zoran questioned about GDPR, something typical for the UK. Zoran, did you want to just?
I was just curious, you know, if it doesn't take a lot of time. I'm curious. That's all.
What's I'm so sorry. I just didn't understand the question.
At the beginning of the talk, you mentioned an acronym, and I did not understand it.
Oh, what GDPR means?
Yes.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
For UK or?
I'm so sorry. This is my mistake. It's just because when you are a lawyer, it's just you get used to those acronyms. So this is basically General Data Protection Regulation. You have seen yes, that was introduced in 2018.
Thank you.
Okay, and always be careful when you quote someone because they're in the audience. So there's Joanna Bryson, I believe, has a question.
Well, I had the question before. I almost said like I don't have a question anymore because she quoted me. But no, there was one we were talking about. There's two problems: the pace of change, whether governance can handle that, and I think you know, as I said in the quote there, that part of what you're trying to do is create an API underneath which there can be lots of motions, but that the constraints that government enforces can be at a higher level, like, you know, providing access to due diligence and things. So I don't think that necessarily means, or maybe that was what you're trying to say. I guess I was slightly confused about what your point was about the pace of change. And then my second question, if I can go very fast, is that I similarly worry about this idea of portability of identity, because that requires that they don't provide a real service. So if there's any structure of the service, if it's not just a diary, it's not just a blog, if there's anything that's sort of doing like creating a sort of network, then you don't want to have the same people on Facebook you're linked to as you are on Twitter, for example, just in terms of what you're trying to say and what you're projecting. So I'm not sure that portability does make sense.
I'm so sorry. Maybe I just slightly misunderstood, but what I was trying to say is that basically, and I do understand that there will be lots of problems because, for example, if we're talking about Twitter and Facebook, those are completely different also they provide different features as well. So there will be lots of difficulties. But I mean, let's say, for example, WhatsApp, Signal, and Telegram. And if you have tried to move your data from WhatsApp to Telegram or Signal, you will see that with Signal, it's even more difficult to do. You are moving like each chat separately, and it doesn't, and still it is not convenient to use. So I can understand that this can be a little bit difficult, and it does sound a bit uncomfortable, digital identity portability. But in fact, what I was also thinking now, as a solution to, for example, moving from Facebook to Twitter, of course, their features are different, but the whole idea of having it in your regulation will also kind of motivate maybe for Twitter to provide new features, or maybe for just competition for other platforms to compete with Facebook, and don't allow concentration of power just in the hands of one corporation.
I super agree with you about that we need to deal with the concentrations of power, and about that this is part of our identity, that we own it. I'm not sure Google Plus should have been allowed to be shut down, but I think there's some real fundamental problems here about whether we want to force all the products to be the same. So this is like identity in general. So I think, yeah, okay, I'll drop out. There's another hand up.
Thank you for that. And there is opportunity this afternoon for people to, we found in previous, just a session where everybody could just talk and expand upon any issues raised, was considered very valuable. So there is that session this afternoon. Jesse, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Nice presentation. I'm not a lawyer, yeah? I'm a philosopher/social scientist, just to make it clear. But I'm a bit divided between two things in your presentation, and I want to ask you which one is correct. Like, are you saying, or on the one hand, we need to make improvements based on existing law, based on our existing system to adjust to certain technologies? Or are you also kind of secretly saying, I was also triggered a bit by your Hegel quote, that there are very fundamental issues with our legal system that almost cannot be adjusted to a technological society that is developing right now? Like, yeah, which one?
Thank you so much. And can I say both are right? And I will explain what I mean. Now, that's why I was trying to say that when we are talking about accountability, it's better to talk about each problem separately. Now, as a PhD researcher, my current research is on deepfake technology. And for example, for deepfake technology at the stage that I am right now, my proposal is that there is a lot that we already have in regulation as a law, that we can just use it in order to regulate deepfakes. And there is no need to have a new deepfake act, for example, that in some countries or in some states in the US are proposed. Now, at the same time, there are very serious new ethical concerns that probably the legal system haven't had a chance to deal with, and the society hasn't had a chance to deal with. Now, for those kind of questions that are extremely ethical, and some of them might be, for example, within healthcare system and within medical law, within those circumstances, yes, we can see that law isn't capable to catch up with it, and there is a new approach, a better approach is needed. Did this answer the question, or?
Definitely, yes. I'll just be interested. No, it's okay. I will email or something, because yeah, it can't be too long.
Thank you. And Anna, as other speakers have done, if you wanted to drop your email into the chats, and Jesse could follow up on that if you chose, either to everyone or privately, you have that facility. So thank you for that. And wonderfully, we're on time, because I was super strict on Anna, and I do apologise, but hopefully you got some good points across. And our next speaker, and again, apologies for mispronouncing your name, is it Seda?
Actually, it's Jada.
Oh, all right. Oh, Jada. Okay, then Jada. And your surname?
Ilgen.
Ilgan. Okay, so I couldn't quite read the font on your surname. So thank you for joining us this afternoon, and you're looking at a very interesting talk on mitigating discriminatory impacts of algorithmic decision-making systems in hiring process, which is a very evocative sector for the use of AI. So thank you. Look forward to your talk. You have 15 minutes.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
That's great.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for organizing this symposium. I am Ceyda Ilgen. I am PhD candidate at the University of Westminster School of Law. In my paper, I analyzed the ways of mitigating discriminatory impacts of algorithmic hiring decision-making systems through bringing it to human rights lens, and in particularly focusing on the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights Framework. In my presentation, I'll be talking about algorithmic hiring decision-making systems in a general perspective with their benefits as well as risks. I will mention discriminatory impacts of such systems, considering the right to non-discrimination. Then I'll be introducing the important role of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights Framework in mitigating the discriminatory impacts of such systems. I'll specifically focus on the responsibility of corporations to respect human rights. Hiring practices are one of the challenging operations of companies and requires going through long processes. Therefore, technology companies such as Google, Microsoft, and IBM are developing and offering algorithmic hiring platforms to accelerate the process. Most companies, such as Unilever, Vodafone, and Intel, are increasingly using these systems in their operations. There are several applications of algorithmic hiring to be used for identifying the most suitable candidates. Job advertising and social media platforms such as LinkedIn, Facebook, Career Builder, Instagram are commonly used to create algorithms for advertising job openings. And applicant tracking systems, pre-screening tools such as intelligent CV screeners, candidates relationship management platforms, and automated interview scheduling are examples of algorithmic use in hiring practices. Algorithms also help recruiters in identifying qualified candidates to be interviewed. Face recognition algorithms and natural language processing algorithms are used during interviews to evaluate candidates' emotions, language use, and tones of voices to decide their suitability for the job position. There are significant benefits of using algorithmic hiring platforms, including savings in cost and time, minimizing risk, increasing productivity, contributing to the diversity and inclusion in workplaces, and thus enhancing the quality of hire by improving the accuracy of predictions about candidates' potential success on the relevant job position. On the other hand, if the data provided by designers to train algorithms flawed, biased, or unrepresentative, then algorithmic hiring systems could perpetuate existing human biases, especially for already marginalized and vulnerable groups of people. For example, if companies previously selected the male dominance people in their, if companies have previously selected dominantly males for high job positions, then new advertisements in social media platforms, for example, are potentially seen by more often by male candidates rather than female candidates, and this is especially common in like science, technology, and engineering sectors. Also, biased outcomes generally come inside after algorithms create a decision. It has been found that Amazon's algorithmic system on CV screening the system was not rating candidates in equal way and not gender naturally, because the algorithms were trained on the previous male dominant applications, and therefore Amazon stopped its using. Also, facial recognition algorithms during interviews can fail to analyze dark-skinned faces due to the lack of diverse training data, and they also adversely impact the decisions about disabled people, because their disability could impact their use of facial expressions and the body languages. And this is also important for me because my PhD topic is mainly related on the facial recognition and their adverse human rights impacts. And also black box algorithms can be produced due to the non-transparency processes of what data are collected, how these data are used, and what the purposes of these uses. And yeah, summarily, the algorithmic hiring systems can interfere in the right to non-discrimination, especially of already underrepresented groups, including females, people of color, and disabled people. The right to non-discrimination means the protection of enjoyment rights and freedoms from unlawful interferences of any grounds, such as gender, race, political opinion, religion, or disability. And more importantly, the risks of the algorithmic decision-making systems on discrimination paved the way for violating the right to privacy, the right to data protection, and to work, freedom of expression and association. Okay. Considering the importance of the right to non-discrimination, especially for enjoying other rights, it has become a significant need to examine the discriminatory impacts of algorithmic decision-making systems through a human rights-based approach in order to be grounded on internationally accepted frameworks. And although companies play a key role in developing and using the algorithmic hiring systems, so far only limited attention has been given to address the discriminatory impacts of such systems on a corporate responsibility platform. And under human rights law, especially under business and human rights field, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the UNGPs, adopted in 2011, constitute the first framework that providing a global standards for preventing and addressing adverse business-related human rights impacts. And the UNGPs are grounded on a three-pillar framework: the duty of states to protect human rights, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and providing access to remedy. The second pillar requires companies to avoid causing or contributing to human rights infringements and addressing such infringements when they exist. The responsibility to respect human rights involves internal operations of companies, and hence the hiring practices are falling within this responsibility. The Guiding Principle 15 shows how companies can fulfill their human rights responsibilities through conducting some operational processes, including enabling access to remedy and adopting some policies. The principles also requires companies to conduct human rights due diligence, aiming to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how companies address their adverse impacts. This operational process involves evaluating actual and potential human rights risks, taking steps according to findings, tracking responses, communicating how adverse impacts are addressed. And this human rights due diligence process must be ongoing because the risks of human rights could change in time due to and depending on the company's evolvements in time. Yeah. And human rights due diligence rests upon applying human rights impact assessments. According to Guiding Principles 19, companies must evaluate actual and potential risks, like in the human rights due diligence, and effectively integrate their findings from assessments. And finally, they must take needed steps in order to prevent and mitigate their adverse impacts. Okay. To responsibility to respect human rights by companies in the context of algorithmic hiring systems, the biased input data should be avoided and algorithms must be audited carefully to make the decision-making process fairness and more unbiased. And even the algorithms are offered by external providers, companies must be aware of the discriminatory outcomes of algorithms, and they must assess these outcomes as potential human rights risks. Companies must not merely relying on the information produced by algorithms, and they must adopt necessary policies in order to prevent and mitigate the actual and potential adverse impacts of using algorithmic hiring systems. More importantly, as it could be difficult to see the discriminatory impacts of algorithmic hiring systems before the algorithms create a decision, the final decision, there should be an ongoing human rights due diligence and impact assessment processes with relevant actors from developers to users. And applying these processes and adopting like the policies will be beneficial to provide the transparency and fairness and to prevent black box algorithms in the algorithmic hiring decision-making processes. What is more, in the debates of algorithmic accountability, the UNGPS can be an effective tool because the accountability is also has a significant role in the UNGPS. The UNGPS requires companies to provide for and also cooperate remediation through legitimate processes when they lead to human rights violations. Okay. To sum up, addressing the discriminatory impacts of algorithmic hiring decision-making systems through the corporate responsibility to respect human rights under the UNGPS has to take the advantage of grounding the conversation in globally recognized standards and globally recognized human rights, management and operational toolkits, transparency and accountability. Okay, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much for that. It's a very interesting topic there. Have we any questions? I can see a hand up by Joanna. Or could be that she's waving.
That's the applause reaction.
Oh, the applause. My apologies.
It's supposed to be clapping. Yeah.
Well done. Yes, and more clapping from Aurora as well. So yeah, that's very positive. Have we any questions? I think it's really useful that you're looking at that the UN, is it UNGP?
Yeah, the UNGPS, yeah.
Yeah, because I've come across that a couple of times. It's not commonly referred to. They tend to look at other human rights frameworks, and I think that's really worth exploring.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and the framework is really important to build up the human rights responsibilities of companies, and as the technology companies play a key role, especially in developing like AI-based technologies. That's why I just want to come them together.
Have we any other questions? I think Anna is still here, so we can always talk. Aurora, yes.
Yes, I was just reflecting, following actually all the presentations that raised the issue of these spheres in which we develop instruments that try to put in boxes and regulate or bring ethical dimensions. And the instrument that Seda mentioned, the guiding principles, is only one of them. And I was wondering about, how Seda, but not only, maybe others may want to comment on that as well, about this intersection that brings interdisciplinarity and jargon at the same time to trying to resolve social problems. More specifically, we are looking to the legal sphere and the technological sphere, the ethical, moral dimension. And I was wondering, Seda, how you see this instrument being useful in the sense of being brought forward, because as some indicated, actually is not that well known. Although, as we will see later in the session where Allison will present herself, we are working towards bringing the issue of responsibility and human rights in particular to the reflection processes within companies, within corporations, within the technology laboratories as well. So how do you see that becoming reality actually, and raising awareness about such instruments, if it's valuable?
Actually, as the UNGPs and the other instruments under business and human rights, like voluntary and soft law, they have still impact on improving the responsibility of companies. And because especially the UNGPs focus on the accountability, for example, the principles third pillar, the third pillar is separately on the access to remedy. So, and this also should be provided by both states and businesses. So in the paper, I mainly focus on the responsibility of companies, but also they must, integrate with the states, because states have also, of course, very strong role in this way. So I could say the UNGP's frameworks, the pillars that they ground on, have a strong impact to bring responsibility and accountability. And also maybe under the BHR, the corporate social responsibility concept can be also taught, because it has also bringing some, for example, if the technology companies lead to violations, then there can be so many campaigns on social media, and it can negatively affect the reputation of technology company. So what I mean, the corporate social responsibility and the UNGPs can be impact on, in a social way, voluntarily, but the society can raise the awareness through the corporate social responsibility, and these are my reflections. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a question from Harish.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. So my question is more to do with the elements of, you were talking about algorithmic recruitment and so on, and what that brings in terms of bias. So there's ways of getting around this, which is kind of similar to what you would do in the recruitment process, right? You'd use some kind of blind recruitment, without which people can actually be quite biased, subconsciously or otherwise. And so the question is, isn't this a bigger problem and something that is beyond algorithmic decision-making, and not really specific to algorithmic decision-making? Because what you could do with algorithms is you could provide them with the same information and ask them to predict gender, for example. Mm-hmm. And if they were unable to predict gender, then you know that you've gotten rid of that element of gender from their decision-making process. And you can go through this in different ways and get rid of different elements. It's kind of that blind screen behind which musicians often perform to have like a fair way of judging their voice or a particular instrument. So do you think that this is specific to algorithms, or do you think this is more of a general problem that we should look at from a broader perspective?
From my point, I think this is broader than just on the algorithms, because actually this is like historical biased outcomes. Actually, the main problems of discriminatory impacts during the algorithmic hiring decision-making systems, the training data could be biased because they provided by designers, by humans, and it can reflect their already existing like the biases and some discriminatory reflections. So yeah, I could say it's broader.
Perfect. Yeah, that's perfect.
My
Thank
opinion.
you. Yeah, I guess it's just removing that information that will lead to bias from prior data so that the training takes place on data that is kind of neutral. But yeah, that makes sense. Thank you very much.
Yes.
I think that's a very good topic of conversation that could be broadened. There was a comment in chat, and then I'll come to Margarita, who has her hand up. So one comment was from Joanna. AI ethics was originally wandering randomly, supporting merging with UNHR's human rights makes all the sense, which I completely agree. Zoran comments that there could be hidden correlations, what an AI system uses implicitly, and I'll jump to Margarita, and I've got another comment that I'll come back to before we close for break. And Margarita.
Yes, thank you very much, Ada, for your very interesting presentation. I just wanted to reflect on the last point about social corporate responsibility and this discussion, because it really relates to previous presentations too. I think that, I mean, from what I've seen in practice, there seems to be a difficulty. I mean, even in, of course, in the public sector, we are a bit behind, but even in a corporate environment with tech companies, there seems to be quite a distance between the legal team, the legal department, and the computing science teams. And this is why I think that we need to approach people from the private sector too, and actually think with them to kind of restructure, to create new structures of communication between these two. Why? Because it seems that it is particularly difficult for computing science professionals to reach the legal, because imagine that in corporate environments, you mostly have smaller teams working on the systems, right? You'll have AI research. I mean, you'll have an AI expert in terms of the creation or training and more particular teams. However, what really is what we see most often is that these smaller teams have to report to just one or two people who usually are the managers, and the communication with the legal is usually happening through the managers. And usually the people on the ground feel kind of intimidated or kind of stressed about their communication with the legal, because the legal won't respond to them directly because they are lower down the hierarchy, or because they don't know how to express what they see on the ground. So I was thinking about the corporate responsibility discussion, that we may need to rethink, even in the corporate environment, how these two different teams work and communicate, and create a more direct kind of avenue and a friendly, if you want, a brainstorming environment for them to actually do work in a meaningful way. Because if we don't do this, it seems that the legal requirements will remain, if you want, a tick box. Because you have a computing science team saying that, oh, okay, do we check this tick box, so it is legal to do this in the first place? Okay, then we'll go forward. And mostly the legal ticking of the boxes happens in the beginning, and then the project evolves and evolves and evolves, and then the legal has no idea what's going on. So this is what I wanted to add on these thoughts. Yes, if this makes sense.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. This is really very, debatable thing for me as well. I think for this point, human-rights due diligence, which I also emphasized in the UNGPs, is important, I think, because, for example, what I found, researchers strongly suggest that it should be ongoing, and also the UNGPs mentioned that the process should be ongoing. So maybe that operational tool might be helpful, because also there are like auditing systems, so the auditors can be incorporated with them, the auditors and the corporations. Yeah, so
I think that's a very important point, to avoid tick boxes, but to make sure it's meaningful. I mean, so you see that with impact assessments. I'm a counsellor, and every motion goes, or every proposal goes forward, it has an equalities impact assessment, and apparently nothing ever impacts on equalities ever. It's just it is a tick box, and how to make that process meaningful. I think we need to really redesign the AI and data science life cycle diagrams and incorporate these due diligence processes and checkpoints in there, which I know some of the standards are doing. We have a comment from Scott. You mentioned Beth Singler is one of the ones who taught me about screens for musician auditions still allowing for discriminatory gender outcomes. Is that reference to the footsteps? Do we still have Scott? Yes. Oh, his audio doesn't work. So yes, that was just a side remark. Yes, the footsteps. Just to explain on that, it's a very famous case, as I'm sure you all know, about auditions and how it transformed in the end the diversity of orchestras. But when it was first produced, it was tested by other researchers, and they sort of disproved it. It doesn't make any difference until it was tested again. And I think this is a good example of how we should conduct peer review and science and academic work. They found that it was actually the footsteps, they could hear the footsteps, and that was enough to influence the choice. And the key point in that was it was men and women who were equally biased. So, it wasn't that one. So that's a very pivotal piece of work, I think. It's trying to get these conversations, multidisciplinary teams together and trying to put in meaningful processes that actually work is quite hard to do. Do we have any other questions? No, I know we didn't have a break really in between the first and the second session, so some of you must be absolutely gasping for a drink, let the dogs out, or a nip to the loo. So if we let you go, and if we come back promptly at 3 o'clock, we should be able to start. Sorry, Aurora.
I apologize. Can I also mention that it seems that there will be some other technological shakeups? I don't know whether Sven would like to say a word, whether we will be booted out again, or but I was asked whether we are taking the break so that this refreshing of the pages may be taking place. So make sure you log back in. If Sven, can you hear us, or? Sorry,
yes, I can.
Yes, yeah. So maybe you want to explain to everybody whether we can expect to be booted out, or?
Hopefully not. I will close the rooms in a minute or two, and then you will be thrown back into the main room. And when the regular session starts, the breakout rooms should be there again. But we can't modify the list of breakout rooms and as long as sessions are running, which is a shortcoming. So you shouldn't be kicked out of this meeting, and it should be the same link. The website has been updated, so there's for each stage is a single link now, so that should all be fine. But this session should be running, so you just find yourself in the main room in a minute or two.
And then we click onto the breakout.
Yes.
So that we join the breakout. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Allison.
Okay, see you all at 3.
I have to remember to turn the mic on. So let's start so that we have as much time as possible for discussion. Although we do also have after the session, depending on attendance, or where we can take questions and simply discuss more general issues, as Allison mentioned already. I've been also reflecting on the idea, given that attendance to the conference has been mitigated both by technological and other administrative challenges that they may have come, so that we may also redo at least the unconference part at a later future, but not in the too far future, the session where we would invite those that have participated and they may want to discuss further general AI normative issues. So we may retake this, the session from 4 o'clock. So let's move on now to the next session that again is going to cover two very interesting topics. We have Daniel Trujillo and Thomas Burry's paper presented by Daniel today that looks into identifying the ethical and legal risks of autonomous robotic system. This is based on a pilot study that I hope you will find, like myself, reading the brief, a very interesting study. Then we will follow with Allison, who is looking to present to us key elements and findings on the ethical funding of trustworthy AI initiative, on which she has been working indeed very hard. So without further ado, I will give the word to Daniel.
Great, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay. So thank you very much for the introduction. I think this is it's great to follow the other presentations that have already come today, because it ties in really well with the work I'm going to discuss now, which, as Aurora said, is titled Identifying the Ethical and Legal Risks of Autonomous Robotic Systems, which was done in a pilot study of last year, in May of 2020. So I'm going to just glaze over this slide in order to try to keep as much time as possible for discussion and questions. But essentially, what we looked at is there was a white paper developed in 2017 with Thomas Burry and 5 other co-authors. And it was a very theoretical approach to essentially a practical evaluation method for evaluating autonomous robotic systems. So actual physical systems, embodied systems. And this is designed mostly with the goal in mind of ethically evaluating search and rescue robots, but then also has an additional component that looks at autonomous weapon systems. And I'll get into that in a minute about why. So then the questions that it attempts to address or how can problematic properties of autonomous robotic systems be actually practically identified? There's a lot of documents and research about principles and ethical approaches, but they're not very practical. And my personal background, so I'm a PhD candidate at the University of St. Gallen now, but previously I was an officer in the US military where I served in combat in Iraq. And then I left the military and went into humanitarian work, essentially doing civil military operations as a humanitarian advisor for both the ICRC, but then also for the US government, the US Agency for International Development. And what's very interesting is that humanitarian work in complex emergencies or natural disasters, so when you use the type of skills that are necessary for humanitarian operations, it's very similar to the kind of environments that you see in conflict zones. And so hence the relationship between autonomous search and rescue robots and and actual autonomous weapon systems. So some of the key concepts that we look at, or the actual definition of autonomy, because in the systems that we look at, the whole system is not necessarily autonomous. Maybe only a subsystem of a particular system that we're looking at is autonomous. And then you also have to take into account international humanitarian law and to some degree international human rights law in non-conflict environments. And then what we rely on is, and what we really are looking at is an applied ethics approach. So this is quite well developed in the health field, but not as well developed in robotics and engineering, which is, I think, Margarita already struck on, that you have these essentially bubbles that people aren't connecting between the legal and philosophers and the actual engineers and roboticists. So what we consider stakeholders is the roboticists, the engineers, and the programmers who don't necessarily have a background in legal or international humanitarian law, as well as ethics and philosophy, but as well as the state governments that are procuring the various systems. So a search and rescue robot wouldn't be purchased by an individual consumer, but maybe a national search and rescue team that goes and deploys overseas to respond in earthquake events. Or for instance, in the Fukushima disaster, where you would need a robotic system to actually go in and address the nuclear waste, where a human response team isn't able to go. And then this also affects the international bodies, such as the Convention on Conventional Weapons, and they have a group of governmental experts that looks at autonomous weapons, as well as the ICRC, which governs or has the mandate for international humanitarian law. And then as well as the general population, because all of these things affect everybody. So to get into the details of what we actually did is we took this white paper, and I'll put the link in the chat after I finish talking, and actually practically applied it. And that was done in May of 2020 to 4 actual systems that had some form of autonomy. And the very first thing that we have to do when we look at this is identify if this is a robotic system or not. And so we ask a series of questions, and it says, yes, okay, this is a robotic system. And then does this system have some autonomy? And that is done on a spectrum. And we look at, it's not a yes or a no, there's actually 5 components to that. For instance, is the system able to operate independently of an energy source? Or like, does it have its own storage of energy? Or does it have some sort of mobility? Now, a system doesn't necessarily have to be mobile, like it doesn't have to be on that spectrum in order to be considered autonomous. As long as it has one aspect of autonomy in that spectrum, then it would be considered being able to be looked at by our schema. So then once you have that, then there's one other additional look or evaluation that you do before you apply the aspects that we're going to get into in more detail. And that is whether it's designed in order to cause harm. And so does it have some sort of kinetic weapon on it? Is this an autonomous weapon system? Yes or no? And that will then cause us to, or trigger us to use 7 additional criteria. So what you see here on the screen is actually a sample of some of the criteria. There's 37 criteria in total, where we take these ethical principles that have been developed, and these are developed and then actually pragmatically and practically developed into these series of questions so that we can create a weight and a rating for various systems. And then that comes up with a combined value. So for example, because I know this can get quite complicated and I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but just as an example, you can look at the criteria or the aspect of cybersecurity. So the core question that we look at when we're evaluating a system is the system resistant to hacking and spoofing? Essentially, have the programmers and engineers design this to be protected? And then for the system that we looked at in this criteria, it had a medium weight. In other words, this is something that for this particular system, it would be problematic at the medium level if it was hacked or spoofed. And then the rating red, meaning that, and it could be green, amber, or red being that they did not build any kind of protections in to protect the system from hacking and spoofing. So you can see here some considerations and why those ratings and that weight were given, which then comes up with a combined value. So that takes me to the next slide, which is then this is the results of the pilot study. And here you can see in the columns, you have 4 various systems that we looked at in depth, and each of the criteria 1 through 37. And the one that we were just looking at before is the ANYMAL system, this system on the far left of the 4 columns. So that system, we look at these core questions and go into deep details about that system for each of these aspects or these properties. And these properties could apply to any system, and all 4 of these systems are very different. One was a rotary wing aircraft, one was a fixed wing aircraft, one was a quadruped vehicle, and then one is a construction equipment with 4 wheels. So you can see here that we then had to visualize the results of our pilot study. And what we ended up doing was creating this multicolored, multi-shaped system. And I think this will probably be modified in the future, but it very quickly shows or displays problematic criteria of certain systems. So for the ANYMAL system, if you look at criteria number 34, it says misuse prevention. So this is where we look at the system, its ability to be misused. And I'll get into that a little bit more on the next slide, but that is a problematic criteria. And so it is considered high risk. Now, this isn't necessarily to say yes or no to any particular system. This is a tool designed to allow a procurement agency or a designer to identify potentially problematic aspects or properties of a system that they are developing or potentially buying. And so they can address it to mitigate those risks. All right, so in this example analysis, we look at the quadruped ANYMAL system. It's a 4-legged system that has sensing, computing, affecting, and communication subsystems, and it's designed to compete in the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency Subterranean Challenge. So DARPA, for anybody who's not familiar with it, is the US military's research and development agency. And they develop products, or they develop competitions for various engineering teams to compete in. And in this particular challenge, it is to develop autonomous robotic systems to do search and rescue operations in a subterranean environment where there would be limited communication with a base station or something like that. So in misuse prevention, aspect 34 of the schema, it asks, to what extent is the system designed to prevent or make difficult unwanted uses of a system? And this particular system, when I interviewed the chief engineer, I said, well, what, and this goes back to what Margarita said in her earlier talk, what is to prevent DARPA, which is a defense research and development agency, from easily using this or converting this from a search and rescue robot in a subterranean environment to use in a combat environment? And then I gave him the example of, as opposed to searching for trapped victims in a collapsed building, it could be easily deployed in the caves in Afghanistan to hunt enemy combatants like the Taliban. And the engineer looked at me and very genuinely said, well, the law will stop that. And I said, I'm sorry, there is no laws that would stop such a system from being used in such a way. Because right now there are no laws. The group of governmental experts in the Convention on Conventional Weapons has not even agreed on a definition of what is an autonomous system. So there is no built-in engineering systems in this particular ANYMAL system to stop undesirable extensions of the scope of use of ANYMAL, and it is a possibility. So then, therefore, it is a high-risk aspect in our evaluation, which then makes the engineers rethink what they're doing, or is there something that they could build in to make it more difficult to weaponize or use in outside of the scope of what they initially designed it to do. Another example is this system is designed to drop Wi-Fi beacons as it travels through a subterranean environment in order to establish a longer communication chain with its base station. But a Wi-Fi beacon that they are using is essentially exactly the same dimensions as a anti-personnel mine. So there's nothing to stop the ANYMAL system from deploying anti-personnel mines as opposed to Wi-Fi beacons, and that's problematic. So the recommendations based on our pilot study, what we would say based on our evaluation is that the humanitarian benefits of such a search and rescue system are really profound. There are really big challenges to using human search and rescue teams. They have to maintain their own safety. It takes a long time. And generally the window for rescuing people in a collapsed building or in an earthquake environment is about 72 hours. After that, you have an exponential decline in their chance of survival. So being able to deploy a search and rescue robot to actually quickly identify where humans may be trapped so that the human search and rescue teams can pinpoint them faster is really profound. However, undesirable extensions of the scope and use of NML are at risk because conflict zones are so similar to natural disaster zones. It's the same type of environments that such a system would be able to work in. And there's also the risk of dual use through the addition of kinetic weapons. It wouldn't be that difficult for someone to add a weapon onto this system. And the NML designers must consciously address the possibility and mitigate that to stop it from being used in warfare, or by using value-sensitive design and intentionally engineering barriers to prevent misuse and weaponization. So the next steps based on this pilot study is that we will probably be going more towards a very standard risk assessment matrix, which is something that most government agencies are very familiar with. And it's something that is used around the world, especially militaries, and that's for training and operations. And essentially going, instead of from a rating and a weight scale or evaluation, going more towards a probability or expected frequency of an event and a severity rating. And that will help to address what are the high risk or high probability and high severity aspects of a certain system, which then a engineer or research and development agency or a procurement agency, or even the public that was involved in using, deciding how tax money would be spent, would then be able to try to address and mitigate some of those risk aspects, or those more risky aspects. And then also to collect more data and identify trends. So right now we've assessed 4 semi-autonomous or autonomous systems, and we would need to do additional evaluations to further refine the schema, the tool that we have, and then also try to identify properties or aspects of systems that maybe are more frequently problematic or more frequently high risk. So it raises attention to the engineering and programming community that these are things that they need to pay attention to. And also by evaluating more systems, we could probably identify normative trends that are taking place around the world to see if there are any general trends that are developing in the absence of legal frameworks and actual clear regulations. So I think I'll stop. This is the last slide. I could get into the details on all of this stuff quite a bit more, but I think it would be great to have discussion and answer questions. So I will end there.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you for keeping very much to the time. I suggest that we continue with, and we have the second presentation again, following the format from previous sessions, so that afterwards we can have sometimes joint questions as well, and hopefully some time for discussion. We follow up with Allison, who is going to explain to us about a very interesting initiative, the ethical funding of trustworthy AI, which is very close to my heart as well, from a research point of view at least, as well, because it very much echoes initiatives that have been with us for a number of years in other fields, in business and the human rights field, that Shreda mentioned earlier in her presentation. So Allison, without further ado, please, you can start your presentation. If you have PowerPoint, you can share it.
Yep, I will do. I was all geared up to ask questions. I didn't realize we were going to go straight on to this. So very interesting, the last talk. Right, hello everybody. Just want to sort of chat to you very quickly about a small project that I've been running, looking at ethical funding for trustworthy AI, and the outcomes of an initial workshop that we ran, which combined researchers from various institutions, from various aspects, computer science researchers, lawyers, social science researchers, and so on and so forth, and also with funding agencies and policy agencies as well. So those two sort of interest groups looking at how we fund AI initiatives and projects going forward. The reason for this, if this works, is that as well as the year of COVID, 2020, certainly in the UK, was very much the year of fuck the algorithm, excuse my language. We had a number of issues with regards to algorithmic systems being legally challenged in the UK and actually elsewhere around the world. There's some examples, many all over the world. So as well as the problems that we had with the off-call algorithm, which actually the algorithm just did what it was told. It was the rules that were fed into it that was the problem. We had a judgment on the visa streaming tool that the UK government used that was seen to be discriminatory. Again, looking at law involving human rights and equalities law, not tech law, because we don't really have any as such in the UK. There was also the upholding of the challenge to the use of facial recognition systems by the Welsh police and other organisations as well, and say that there was an infringement on privacy. And I could go on, but there were many, many examples in 2020 which really highlighted this issue. And we've been saying for quite a while that we were going to start seeing legal action against algorithms that were discriminatory and unfair. And why? In that respect, I was thinking, well, why are these happening still? Many of us here are very, very embedded within the AI ethics field. Understand that there are a plethora of organisations around the world and of principles around the world guiding people, procurement guidelines on how to ethically procure your AI system. So the Office for AI in the UK have a very, very good procurement guidelines for AI, for local government to procure, and yet we are repeatedly seeing systems being developed and implemented that do not adhere to any sort of these ethical principles and cause these levels of harm. How is that still happening? Where is the mismatch? And as Margarita talked about, one, which is the legal teams don't respond to each other. And an added concern was the amount of money that's been spent and funded into AI. Now, I'm just focusing purely on the research arena at the moment, the research environment. So this is the UKRI, so the UK's umbrella funding organisation under which various other funding agencies sit. And there are others separate to this as well. But in their AI review for 2020-2021, they mentioned that they are spending over £1 billion in 1 year supporting research and innovation activities related to AI. And we can see within their report the breakdown here: 135 million looking at people and skills, including the doctoral training centres, 530 million looking at the production of novel AI algorithms and applications, and 410 million in key strategic investment using or supporting the development. So this is a huge amount of money going into this. So we have all the procurement guidelines, we all have the ethical principle guidelines, and we have a lot of money going in, and we're still having these problems. So I got really annoyed and put out a tweet and had a tantrum and go, why is this still happening? Why is it, how are we going to sort this problem out? And I thought, well, let's hit them where it hurts. Let's hit them at the flow of money, because we can have conference after conference after conference highlighting ethical principles, highlighting the various mechanisms and processes we can go through, but we cannot educate everybody on this. It's really hard. It's a challenging issue to do. So we need to start thinking of structural things such as those screens in orchestra auditions, operational mechanisms by which we can change the process, get people to educate themselves or remove those barriers and have a look at it. So I started thinking about how we would get funding organisations to assume some responsibility and consider the flow of money, and how we could get researchers, private organisations as well as academic organisations, actually having to adhere to these principles and making that effort and actually structuring it. And if they want the money, then you need to develop ethical AI. So as response to that tweet, some colleagues from the Health Foundation responded to me, and other colleagues who I work with in the Standards Organisation responded to me, and colleagues in Women Leading in AI responded to me, and we started to develop a proposal laced around a trustworthy AI statement, which I'll come to later on. So I mentioned earlier on that we have all of these AI principles all around the world, and I think Harvard did one of them, about 36, but there's many, many, many more. I've written a few of them myself, and I'm involved in all the standards, but this is a classic example. So this is ALT-AI, so this is the EU high-level experts groups sort of, principles of how you could design an ethical AI in this respect. But there's IEEE, have an ethically aligned design system as well, which is very useful. But I picked this one as a nice summary of the sort of key themes that you see in any of these principles coming through. I'll link there and how they've broken that down. So building around ALT-AI as an example, we worked together to develop a proposal of how funding organisations could implement a system of governance of when you are putting out grant calls for AI, how can you simply and effectively ensure that the researchers and the applicants are considering these principles and trying to design their AI systems in an ethical way, and even stopping to think, is AI the solution that we need for this problem? So that was the approach that we took. And we had two proposals. So the first proposal, which was originally the only proposal, was the introduction of a trustworthy AI statement. So this was very simple, little section in the application form. If any of you have ever had to do a grant application, they are horrendous and horrible and take way more time than actually justifies the fact that you nearly always get them rejected. And it's really hard. I have a number of researchers coming to me going, we've been told to make our AI application more trustworthy AI. How do we do this? And building it in that thread through that application is quite difficult. Sitting on a number of grant review panels, there's very few people who are trained to know what to spot for necessarily, and understand the system. Why are you not doing this? Why are you not doing that? What do you mean by trustworthy? What do you mean by explainable? Using interpretable. What are your fairness tests? Why have you chosen that fairness test? Looking at the diversity of the team, looking at stakeholder involvement, and so on and so forth. So it's quite a complex thing. So to make it simple for the researchers and simple for the funding panels to actually be able to pluck out that information, and for the people to say, right, we've used Daniel's system of impact assessment, we're going to run it through this, and we're going to review this process and so on, and start naming what they're using, naming the principles. So nice little box, 300 words, 1,000 words, depending on the funding, for people to introduce their trustworthy AI statement, say how they're going to develop this in an ethical way. And with that proposal, there are a number of guidelines that we listed for them. So that this is part of a much larger paper that's going to be published in Springer's Ethics and AI later on. So here we go. So applicants must outline in the trustworthy AI statement section of the application form how they've taken meaningful action to ensure the AI project aligns with the principles of ethical and responsible AI design. That's all well and good. But it might be something that is just a tick box exercise, and everybody nods and they've done it, and it doesn't mean anything in the long run as the project progresses. So we need to look at a government system. Also, there's more examples of guiding criteria there, looking at data, looking at algorithmic bias and benefits and losses, and so on and so forth. So you see a lot of what we talked about today building into that. There's other things, whistleblower processes as well will come up later on, but that needs to be seen to actually having to work, because this will be another thing of such having principles that don't actually mean anything. And Joanna Bryson earlier on was chatting to me, and she said, oh yes, they've done it, principles for robotics by ESPRC. There's a whole set of principles which she was involved in writing in, but they don't implement them. They don't require them to be taken part. They're just there. So it's a meaningless action, really. So we need to make sure it has teeth. So proposal 2 grew out of that one as to how would a funding body actually manage this process. And so we came up with lists of how management of grant funding bodies would work. Funding bodies would support applicants by providing resources or links to resources that will aid the applicant in considering how to design ethical AI, might produce an ethical AI checklist. So similar to some case studies we looked at Horizon 2020, checklist for ethics in general. And they touch on data privacy and that. So there are some examples out there how it could work. And there's some guidance as to how the funding agencies would work. And again, there's a whole load more suggestions in that in the main paper. And then we put down the idea of trustworthy AI boards purely because we were looking at things like bioethics boards and other systems that we've been brought in as an example. So this is just a proposal document. So we talked about trustworthy AI boards. A board could provide an avenue for safe whistleblowing. Should any person involved in the project have reservations, provide expert feedback, and play a role in supporting funding managers in the ongoing monitoring of projects. So again, this is not something that should occur at the start and then never get looked at again. This process should occur throughout. So it has a huge requirement on funding bodies to actually manage this process. So from that, we set up a quick workshop. I'm keeping an eye on my time, Aurora, because I always overrun. And we got all these people together, some quite high level researchers and funding organisations, chaired by NHSX, which was very kindly to doing that, who are supporting the AI award, which is a multi-million-pound funding award. And we asked these groups different questions. We kept the funders away from the academics so that they didn't start lobbying for grants, and so they felt it was a safe zone. And we put these ideas to them. And overall, what do you think in general to looking at, the responsibilities of funding organisations? And then we asked them to look at proposal 1 and proposal 2 in depth using a Miro board. And the outcomes were quite interesting because we saw a split between funding agencies and researchers. So in general, everybody was really, really keen on this. And this was just a very brief sentiment analysis of the output from the Miro board, running through an online sentiment analysis tool. It's not the proper analysis that I'm intending to do. But overall, the funders were positive, as were the researchers, quite strongly positive, actually. To question 2, the trustworthy AI statement, again, funders were positive, researchers moderately positive. Really, do we have to write more? Not so keen, but you have to think about, well, it might just make your life easier. I know this from people coming to me. And then the idea of the board or the management structure behind it, this is where it fell down. And we had neutral and strongly negative. And this is where I think we're finding the problem. We can all do these lovely little systems and little seeming solutions, but backing them up so they actually are meaningful is the greater challenge. And this is where people and opinions diverge quite a lot. The strongly negative, I think, in the researchers is a bit of a misnomer there, because if you read the statements that they make, what they do is they're not negative to the concept, but they started talking about how it could be actually implemented and the problems to do with implementation, hence it came out as negative. So a stronger analysis and thematic analysis of that needs to occur. But there are some quotes here, and I've just pulled them out randomly. So it isn't a single solution and should be treated as a facet of a wider solution involving the applicants, funders and regulators. Absolutely, there is no one cure-all to any of these. The question that is really good, what responsibility should funders have? We talk about accountability, don't we, and responsibility. And yet, if you're spending public money, you've got the Nolan principles. It's on you to make sure that you do that with integrity and it's fed through and doesn't cause harm. The project assessment of the statement must have teeth. And this is the classic example that we have with anything to do with standards and regulators and stuff like that. If it doesn't have teeth, it becomes a tick box exercise. And it creates a point of reflection, which was my original goal. It will create a point of reflection for the applicant and the funder to consider when they are actually making that system. And in truth, that was originally my only thought on this. So future work, obviously I need to do a greater thematic analysis of the workshop outcomes to have a real understanding of people's thoughts on that. We will need to then review those proposals and maybe even rewrite them. And I want to do follow-up interviews of some of the participants to sort of really broaden out, because there were some very positive suggestions, some interesting suggestions that might fill in some better governance way. But I would also very keenly like to do some case studies, because already from the outcome from that workshop, one funding organisation has already implemented 3 of the guiding criteria from proposal 1 in their next funding call, which is a huge funding call. And another funding agency is actually considering the proposals as a whole to see how they would manage moving forward. So this has had impact almost immediately. And so I would love to gain permission from those to actually say, well, does it make a difference? Does it make a difference to the researchers? Does it make a difference in the type of funding and the projects that you have funded? And how have you managed it going forward, so we can learn from this, so that whatever system that we incorporate, it is actually meaningful. And I shall leave it there. And I want to just thank the people who were staffed enough to respond to my tweet. I'm from Keele University, the Health Foundation, my wonderful colleague I know from the Standards Organisation, he's under the BCS headlines there, and another member from Women Leading in AI. So they were the ones. Don't respond to my tweets. It causes you to have some extra work. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Allison.
I've got to try and stop sharing now.
Yes, I thought when putting together this, that the 2 perspectives were very much complementing each other in looking to a great extent to operationalizing ideas and operationalizing principles, if we can say so. So I look forward to hear what questions. I have a number here, but let's see what questions the audience may have.
I have a question for Daniel.
Okay, go ahead, Allison. Have the privilege of
yeah. So whenever you do these risk assessments or risk impact assessments, and you look at weightings or ratings, they're very much a case of just value judgments. So I'm just wondering how you guard against that. And one of the worries that we have is often we have these value judgments made by homogenous teams with their own interests and conflicting interests, shall we say, and biases, and what they may view as a moderate or low risk, another person might view as a high risk. How would you manage that?
Yeah, that's definitely a concern with any kind of evaluation system like this. And the way that is mitigated, I didn't get into it in the discussion just for the sake of time, but the actual evaluation tool, it's not, it's quite in depth. So there's a core question that guides each aspect that we're looking at. And then for the rating and the weight criteria, there are a series of questions, and it's quite clear what rating a particular aspect would get based on the actual system's properties. So for instance, a public opinion, like the one of the aspects is public opinion, and some of the criteria or the questions that you would discuss with the team or whoever it is that is looking at a particular system would then ask, okay, has there been any public forums in order to discuss this system that you're designing? Has there been public outreach? Like a whole series of questions that then go into the rating and the weight, which then gives you that overall composite information. So it's actually quite, we try to take the subjectivity out of it as much as possible. And I think that's it's a very important question, because in order to make something actually practical, it can't just be guiding principles. This is my big problem with all of these ethical principles that are out there. They're so fuzzy. And coming from a very practical background myself, it's all about pragmatic, practical answers that cannot be subjective. It has to be more objective and objectified in order to actually mitigate the risks of some of these things that we're developing or that are developing in the absence of the law.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Very interesting. Thank you, Allison, for raising this issue. Indeed, it seemed to me as well that the issue of the risk assessment and the value judgment that come into place, and the various spheres of action, such as the one Daniel is leaning to research, the challenges that come from that actually push to a certain extent, or makes it imperative, it seemed to me, like that the discussion is opened up, because in order to make it more objective, which is almost an unachievable, or it is actually unachievable, but in order to make it acceptable, we need to open the discussion so that it acquires public social backing, which means we need to reach that platform of agreement of what, of how we scale the various risks and how we evaluate them. As we know, in hospitals, we put a price per life, how much funding we can put into saving a life, and sometimes because this is the reality of life, so to speak, and the limited resources. Equally, in the AI environment, it seemed to me like there is a call for this kind of debate to take place, and hopefully the symposium is kind of contributing to this as well. So thank you very much, Daniel. Very interesting points. We have Jesse, then followed by Margarita.
Thank you. I actually have two questions. I had the same question to Daniel as Allison had, but I also had another very small question. You're all the time talking about a tool. Does this also really mean that you have a certain application that can be downloaded from GitHub or whatever?
No, not yet. That's actually that's part of the funding that we have is okay, to develop an app to actually have this as a tool. Right now, it's a paper tool okay, in the white paper. Yeah, but that is definitely one of the I guess ambitions.
Cool. I will try to keep myself updated. Then, sorry, I had another question to Allison. I don't know if that's okay. Aurora?
Yes.
Yeah. It's almost actually the same question as I asked earlier to, I think, Anna. Yeah. But I would just be interested in your answer. Namely, don't you think that ethics, at least from my perspective as a philosopher, they are always kind of added? So they are always an additional thing. Like, is it not fundamentally impossible to make them, to make technology fundamentally ethical? I know it's a little bit of a stupid question, but I'm actually more interested in.
It's not a stupid question, and I think it highlights an issue that I have. I think people are using a lot of terms and meaning something different, and when you work in the standards and you're trying to get everything, you know, the semantics is really important. I mean, ethics, if you're being really pure, and please correct me if you're a philosopher, is that's just a system of rules and guidelines that we put in place. You know, it is almost separate to morals and values, and I think that gets lost in the process. So, you know, you can have something that is adhering to ethical guidelines, which is absolutely moral, a system, you know. So this understanding of what ethics is, I think, in people like me, and actually people like Daniel, who I come from a science tech background. I'm very pragmatic, very practical, and I'm just thinking about from an applied approach and getting that through. So yes, I agree, but I think we now need to stop with adding on and adding on and adding on, and just get into sort of meaningful ways to get this actually enacted. But we can get lost in an awful lot of arguments with semantics as well, like don't go there with trustworthy and what's responsible, you know, this is what they go, and don't even ask, well, what do you mean by AI? Because that's the whole day gone then in arguments. So yes, I agree with you. It could, and it is a problem.
Thank you very much, Allison. A question from Margarita we have.
Thank you very much both for your very fascinating presentations. I really enjoyed both. I must say you do very fascinating work. First to Daniel, I wanted to ask actually. I mean, this is a very challenging area to work in, and actually this research I was thinking that actually reflects that who is the regulator and who is the regulatee. I mean, in this kind of research actually exposes the problem that actually now the chief engineer thought, okay, the law is going to do it, to set the confines, but when we realize that, I mean, in this case, there was no law in this regard. And in this case, who is the regulator? The regulator who sets the confines within which the operation is going to work is actually the engineer. So I'm not really sure whether the whole team or the teams in other areas too working on similar projects have understood this kind of situation and the responsibility, the burden on their shoulders. So this is something that needs to be communicated, I think, in these interactions. And I kind of thinking, actually, I had another thought too. So these are more kind of comments and reflections rather than a question, but I was thinking that maybe the research design and the methodology could also be transferred to environmental catastrophes. But I don't know if you're aware of any works that have done that. I mean, identifying maybe people in fire conditions and maybe that there are particular similar risks coming from these projects. I don't know if you're aware of any of such works.
Well, so regarding the regulations, the guiding, so when you start talking about autonomous weapon systems, robots that are designed for causing harm, which is part of what we look at, then you start looking, you're using international humanitarian law. So the ICRC has the mandate for that. And at the state level, states are required to do an Article 36 weapons review process as part of the introduction of a new weapons or means of warfare. But there is no, one of the things that's really interesting about these discussions with regard to autonomous weapon systems at the UN, which is the group of governmental experts that I referred to earlier at the CCW, the Convention on Conventional Weapons, they have realized that the Article 36 weapons review process, it's very, like the guidelines are there, and there's over 100 signatories to the CCW and the Geneva Conventions and all of these things. However, there is no formal or universal form of doing an Article 36 weapons review. So some countries do it one way, another country does it another way. Some countries are very public about the way they do it. Other countries, you don't know anything. They just say, yes, we do an Article 36 weapons review. But there's no actual guidelines that specifically say what needs to be done. The idea of an Article 36 weapons review is to see if a weapon is going to be proportionate, if it can, if there's the element of distinction, if it adheres to the Martens Clause, which means that it doesn't violate some form of humanity, and those things. But those are very general principles that come from the Geneva Conventions. So it's really interesting. And then when you start thinking about applying an Article 36 weapons review to a autonomous weapons system that could potentially have the ability to identify and choose targets and then choose whether or not to use lethal force, that opens a whole different can of worms. And that's where I think governing bodies are really having a hard time. And then as to search and rescue systems, yes, they would be applicable to earthquakes, to fire, to collapsed buildings, or to even a flood. That would be the idea behind international search and rescue robotics systems. And the Fukushima disaster is a very good example because they've been throwing robots at that problem set for a decade now. And they still have not really completely, I guess, captured all the nuclear waste from that disaster. And there's actually I think there was a quite good Wired article about it only a few months ago. So if you're interested, I'm sure it wouldn't be hard to find.
Sure, great. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I would suggest that we take the two quick, hopefully, questions and maybe one sentence answers from Deborah and Marinus, because they have put their hand up. But we come back for the unconference session, which is an open discussion on issues that likely would not have been covered here. So hopefully we can pick up on some of the key issues that were raised throughout the presentations as well. So Deborah, would you be able to give us your question briefly, and then we see the answers equally briefly, and then with Marinus we follow. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be brief. My question, first of all, thank you for two fantastic presentations. They were really interesting. My question really is to Allison, and it's just regarding what the actual content is of the kind of trustworthy requirements and practical applications. So my research is looking at the field of data inferences, and particularly high-risk data inferences, so ones that are low verifiable or prediction-based. And so would such use of data within an AI application, would a funder kind of call that in as particularly high risk? Would there be different kind of levels of applications that would receive kind of further investigation and consideration, and kind of how would that work? Because I think it's great that you're moving towards, that we're looking at the funders and moving towards actually building it in substantively. And I'm just interested, I suppose, in more detail about how the practical process would work.
And I think that is why there was that negative response to question 3, is that how it would actually physically work is the real challenge. And I don't really know. That was why we did the workshop. It was to sort of throw it out there and see what they can come up with. It is really, really important. But I would also argue that such a process would not necessarily, it's not a pass-fail situation. So, it's really asking how are you doing, what are you doing to govern this to make sure it's as good as possible, and how will you mitigate against where you cannot cover for this one? So what are your safeguards? So long as you're putting those in, I don't think it would limit you. And I think it's just, whereas it's convincing them, but I wouldn't mind getting in contact with you, because that's very specific and very useful. So the answer is I don't really know, because I'm not a funding body. So how they manage systems is a bit difficult.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, we move quickly to Marinus with the brief answer as well, hopefully, and then we take a short break.
Yeah, my question was to Allison, and it was on this ethics checklist. In my past, I've served on an ethics committee for my sins, which must have been many and terrible, because it's the most work I ever did for the least appreciated by the people around me. But something we found all the time is that's very obvious when people write us applications, is they've first written the research project, the science for the research project, and then they copy and paste and rearrange the things from the research proposal into all the boxes which aren't research proposals, including the ethics applications. And I wondered if there is anything we can do to get a more, just a better way to fill out these exercises and answer these questions without having the ethics already in the design of the experiment. Because once you have the experiment or the project designed first, and then you're filling in the boxes afterwards, it's always going to be tacked on to some extent. So if we have, like we have in the AI domain, people talk about having the ethics built into the design of the AI, whether there's any other way to get a good answers of these kinds of ethics checklists.
Thank you, Marinus. Alison?
I will try and be quick with my answer with that one. I see what you're saying, but but this is in the process of, I'm speaking as a sort of computer science specialist. So what I would be looking for an AI project, the governance has to happen throughout, and all the various checklists with the principles. But I'm thinking about things like, we're using data sheets, or we're using an algorithmic impact assessment. what fairness tests are you doing, and how, you know, your mitigations, and it's the checkpoints throughout the whole process that you put in for it, and it sort of travels beyond the AI system in terms of including human computer interact, you know, the interface, because that can influence decision making and the outcome of it. So when I've been trying to design grant applications, trying to instill that thread all the way through is incredibly difficult. And then I noticed that people on these panels didn't know what they were looking for, so they didn't know how to flag it up. So this is why I pulled it out separately. I completely agree with you. But I've also seen it when they've tried to develop, and then what they do is they shove trustworthy, or they shove explainable in front of AI and think that governs it, and they're doing it, and whereas they don't follow it through with, well, you know, I'm going to use Lime, I'm going to use Shapley, I'm going to use, Fairlearn, you know, I'm going to use various systems like that one. So it was a way of trying to get them to think about that process in a little bit more detail. And I would love it that they wouldn't need it in the end and it had to be embedded in. So, but your point is, it is horrendous. And some people have said it doesn't work, these ethics boards. So this is the challenge.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Allison. Let's take a very quick break and we come back. Thank you, Marinus. I totally sympathize. Currently chairing a research ethics committee, and I am thinking for my sins as well. Indeed, I also like very much that you transfer these to the challenges that come in other fields, such as still research field of artificial intelligence. Thank you everybody for participating. So thank you for to all the presenters, and we meet briefly in 2 minutes, let's say, back for the unconference, where we will develop some of these ideas. Hopefully make a list, a mental list of what you would like to put on the table. Thank you. Yes, Yasmin. Sorry, I was replying to in private chat to your question. I replied to Allison. Yes, we are resuming shortly.
I'm reading all the replies from Marinus about the split between ethics and morals. There's a really good debate going on.
Yes, yeah. I have a little set of questions or issues that we can put on the.
It's been a really good every talk. I'm shame Anna isn't here actually, but the fact that we talk about multidisciplinary teams, don't we? And we say that the computer science, the developers don't talk to the legal people. In fact, if I'm really honest with you, they probably spend the whole time trying to avoid them, let alone just not talking. It's just like,
and the other way around.
Yeah.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
It's difficult.
It's not common that you have a group of in a laboratory of scientists saying, what about bringing a social legal expert here or something? It's I think it's common because there are many forces that push us into silos, and as soon as we are out of that, we need clarifications, we need new parameters to understand. Somebody mentioned earlier about the jargons. I think that we tend to develop that. Definitely we have it in law, but I don't think that AI is stranger to that either.
Oh yeah, and well, what you have when you have a multidisciplinary subject, as I always say, data science multidisciplinary, you'll be using the same term, but they'll have two completely different meanings in the different contexts, which causes so much problems.
Then a lot of misconception as well that comes, and this brings me back to the initial comments I heard from Danielle earlier about the technology and the use of and our mishap with technology. When years back, when joining the AISB, I think to a great extent, and I realized that I wasn't the only one thinking that it's predominantly made up of technology people, people that are programming and people that are really working with robotics, but it's not only, it is sufficiently interdisciplinary so that we can afford actually to fail using the technology, even the more basic ones, such as Zoom.
I think what's been good about today, though, it's very easy to want to have regulation, but that's actually regulation often is a reactive solution where the problems will occur and then you get told off for it, and eventually things will settle down and not happen. Whereas what we want to try and do with, you know, suggestions such as Daniel's and mine, and this better conversation between legal people and looking at the UNGP that say, it's how we could get it right to begin with, so that when it gets to this idea of regulation, it's a self-regulation thing that we were talking about earlier, wasn't it? And so if we can do that right, but then you do still need that regulator at the end to really show it. I was a bit worried about it. Was it Seda said access to remedy is in the systems there, and that's been one area that's a real challenge. I don't know if you've looked at the online harms white paper, but there's no ombudsman, there's no regulator for people subjected to online harms. They can develop super complaints, but that's very specific. It all falls down at that point if the person impacted hasn't got right to remedy.
Access to remedy is indeed one of the bigger challenges generally, considering the whole, we already have a couple of decades of development of the business and human rights and corporate social responsibility, including the framework that is provided by the UN regarding the guiding principles, and access to remedy is one lagging behind. By a good stretch, so to speak, as opposed to developing instruments, developing initiatives, and so on. So, but in relation to this, I don't know, others would have their own issues maybe to bring to the table. I noted down along the discussion today, along the presentations, listening, a number of issues that would be, we can only throw them on and then we pick up whatever we may think necessary. One stems from, somebody mentioned about meta research. I believe it was Margarita. I'm not sure this now because I put them in a mind map or something. And however, apart from that, I was wondering the extent to which we may even speaking and needing a type of meta-regulation. And this is already a concept that has been developed, something that is interactive, that requires, is not the type of traditional government brought or international institution brought that says this is how things should be organized. And I have the government muscle and strengths to back it up and punish where that is. So it's a more of an interaction, it's a more of a co-developed regulation. So this is one thing that came to mind, also stemming from business and human rights area of developed. Then a number of other issues that came to my mind again were about the extent to which we can address normative regulatory issues without addressing foundational philosophical ones. So again, it came from a number of presentations where presenters said, well, I'm dealing with, I think Jessie was, I'm dealing with this, look, focus on this word here on the title, that the governance one. This is what I'm looking into. And I find that often we are hurting ourselves against the wall, a wall of, yes, but in order to regulate, in order to design governance structures, we need to decide what the stakeholders are, who is around the table, and who is going to shape the concepts and what concepts we are going to put forward. If we start from the most basic ones of what Allison mentioned, what artificial intelligence is, and which means what comes under the umbrella of a particular regulation or governance structure. Yeah, does a particular instrument come or not, or what where law applies, whether it applies to a particular AI algorithm or not, and so on. So for me, these remain perennial questions that that need to be addressed. One other that again suggests that need for governance instruments that are to a certain extent fairly complex and in order to address what the original title, our sessions had titles initially that couldn't be fitted in by the convention organizers. So, and the first session, the introductory remarks that I didn't reach in the end to put forward in order to save some time, we're referring to the idea of Uber regulation, which didn't, Margarita, because her presentation initially referred to Uber, to the company, said, well, I'm not talking about this any longer, but the title I put about Uber regulation referred to, try to use a word, the meaning of the word of this, like I said, meta regulation, Uber regulation, something that manages to address issues and social phenomena that are already running ahead of us and that are going so fast in development, for which we do not have those structures to catch, so to speak. And one, well, at least one other item that I was thinking that we may want to reflect on, and that Allison in a way brought also some of her, but not only, she does a presentation of the relevance of the guiding principles from the UN. I mentioned in my cover note other initiatives as well. So the other issue would be whether we should actually put a moratorium almost on developing new sets of principles of AI and instruments. So are we in a way victims of too many initiatives, and we go into fragmentation and with the consequences that may come from this? So these are just throwing up some of the, and maybe others will, I'm sure others will want to add to this as well. So I'm not sure whether Margarita or Allison was first with a hand up. Margarita, and then Allison, and then we have Daniel.
Thank you, Aurora, for this. I wanted to actually reflect on these thoughts and actually to provide a little bit background on the Uber issue, because I mean, we saw it on the program first. This was a story about Uber creating actually a solution, a regulatory solution for an unsolved problem regarding taxis in the UK. Exactly because taxis and private hire cars, as Uber cars, can actually travel all over the country and operate on a single license. So I, as Uber, can actually take a license from Wolverhampton and actually operate all across the UK. And local licensing authorities had a problem with that because they could not enforce safety regulations on a car, on an Uber car, let's say, when they had not provided the license to the car, and there was this enforcement problem actually, and this is where Uber came and created a technological solution for actually limiting the rides, the ride requests. So an Uber driver can now only receive a ride request within a particular area to actually help the local licensing authorities whose hands were tied. So this was the initial story about, but this was my last year abstract, which is now a published article, and this is why I changed today's presentation too. I wanted to also reflect on the meta-regulation thought, which I find very interesting. The study, I mean, the issue is mostly, if I'm not wrong, analyzed in the context of environment, human rights and environmental regulations, I think there is a study, Simon in Australia wrote something about meta-regulation in energy industry in Australia, if I'm not wrong. And I think, I mean, the main issue with these efforts in this field is actually the common problem that we deal with in these other sectors too, right? The regulatory capture, that if we bring these actors together, it is very likely that the public actor would be impressed by the knowledge of the private actor describing the problem and what needs to be done, and actually in the end adopting the private actor's perspective. And really, I'm not, this is a really big challenge. I don't know how this can be dealt with in practice. It's a good discussion to be made. And a final thought I had with regard to the online harms that Allison mentioned, and relates to the problem that we have with legal frameworks that are not outward looking, is, I mean, for example, with online harms, right? It says that, okay, we should regulate illegal activity online on the environments of the social media platforms, let's say. And this is currently, I mean, this will cover a very small circle of what really needs to be regulated out there, because illegal activity is, I mean, illegal activity, okay. One researcher says, okay, let's take some time to look at what is illegal activity. Then you realize hate speech is an illegal activity because we have hate speech laws. But then how can we compute the elements of hate speech? Because, I mean, computer science teams will say, okay, what is hate speech? And then good luck, because there is no legal definition of hate speech. It is just a concept that it is created and reconstructed again and again through case law. So there is no single definition of it. And if we go to the even constitution, the elements that constitutes hate speech is that we have a protected group, a group that it is under attack, that the attack is disproportionate, and that we have incitement of hatred or violence. Now, what can we do computationally to operationalize disproportionate, or how can we operationalize incitement to hatred? So again, I think there is like a misalignment there, and there needs to be a lot of work done for the people working on this to make sense of the regulations.
Yes, thank you, Margarita. Very, very good points. Not to speak regarding the last comments on regulation and use of hate speech or non-use or illegality. Not to speak about the jurisdictional challenges, yeah, because we can speak in a particular area of the world where that may be very well policed and well regulated, but not across the world where that speech is reaching. So, but again, that comes with the fragmentation in a way of normative sphere, so to speak. Allison, you've been waiting very patiently, and then let's put your items on the table as well.
Yeah, no, not at all. I've been dealing with my dog because it's dog walking time. That is a really interesting one, because that is a challenge for Daniel. So this is not what my response was, but this is to what Margarita said. You know, when you talk about what is legal and what is considered safety, when you set up systems, Daniel, like you are, law can change and situations can change, and that then impacts upon how you do your system. So I think it must be always important that people realize that you can't just develop a tool or develop a standard or develop a thing and then park it and it's there, it's done, because the constant need to update and monitor and make it very specific to a use case as well is quite a challenge, which is one of the reasons why we don't have an AI or technology regulator as such, because it touches on so many different sectors, which leads me back to why I put my hand up, which is, I think we need to put a moratorium on absolutely everything, as we put a moratorium on facial recognition things, but no more principles. They're starting to repeat each other. But I'm also slightly concerned that there is a a rush to make this all money making and a business opportunity, and seeing audit firms and seeing people running these systems up and training it, which is fabulous. But what we will not have is anybody completely independent, and this comes back to regulation as well, where if we all have all these certification systems of, oh, I've been certificated, I've got a kite mark for this, or I've got a certificate for that, and I'm adhering to that, it's actually meaningless to the ordinary user impacted by that system. It might be interesting to people within, the industry, but to an individual, it is meaningless, and there's so many workarounds, which is why I always do come back to the idea of a singular regulator, so that there is a one go-to body. I'd love an ombudsman, but a singular system that cannot be monetized. So I talk about things like using an info mark that can be governed, and it's the same mark used over and over and over again, so everybody can see, and they all know how their right, access to remedy is, which I'm really keen about. I think we need to look at that, and there's a lot of resistance to that. So it is still a hugely challenging field. So a moratorium on AI principles, yes, and a little bit of a break on the rush to develop auditing and to develop that, because I don't think we're there yet in how we can implement these systems. So, and the law isn't there at all, in my view.
Thanks, Allison. Very indeed, very interesting points regarding why self-regulation in a way implied, and the need for a singular regulator, while recognizing the challenges. I would think for those. So we realize that technology comes in, new technologies even comes with a variety of applications and with a variety of ways of being developed. And part of the speed with which that takes place is in a way the problem. When we speak about regulating, however, we have to realize that the regulations comes with, it's almost like a demand of generality. And this is one of the points that are often raised, that regulating, and this is not only in technology, this has been raised as a point in relation to, for instance, when the initial summit decades ago, when the movement towards corporate social responsibility has started, saying that, well, we cannot think to apply similar sets of rules to oil extraction companies and to cotton production companies, and because the processes are different, and so this is one issue that we are confronted with. Now with technology, this is why I chose for using the term of Uber governance, in the sense that we expect, while we are going to apply to areas that can be very diverse, from use of an algorithm to use of a huge robot that can both damage in different ways social interaction and social society as a whole. So while we have this, we realize that we still need that level of generality, that we should be able to apply a similar set of principles that are general enough to be able to apply to these very different contexts. And part of this becomes then the mechanism of creating that is having that authority or set of authorities probably that are also the ones giving the signal whether we have interpreted or not, whether we have applied it or not correctly. For the general, for your actions and mine, we have courts. We interpret self-defense in a particular way, and sometimes we get it wrong. We know there have been cases all over when you can shoot somebody in self-defense, thinking it's self-defense, and the courts find you not. And that pushes us to adjust the barometer of what we are allowed to do. I think we have to allow this for bodies that are researching and bodies that are applying technology and making use of technology, that we cannot have the level of specificity and generality put together in one instrument easily without that process of applying those and allowing this process of learning in the social life, in the use of technology. So, but let's see if anybody would like to bring on the table. Yes, Daniel.
So I think a couple of points. Aurora, you just touched on one thing that I think is really a huge problem, and that is the disconnect between discussions about the ethics of artificial intelligence and the ethics of autonomous systems, like autonomous robotic systems. So you have this notion of an embodied robotic system that uses an algorithm to have autonomous functionality. So really it's the software that's driving this autonomous functionality. But then you have artificial intelligence, AI, or discussions about pure software systems. And that discussion about regulations and how that can be governed is far behind the discussions of actual autonomous robotic systems. And that is a huge problem because really it's the algorithm that has the autonomous functionality, and you have AI that has certain autonomous functions already. And I think that disconnect, I don't know how to solve it, but I think that disconnect exists, and it's something that we all need to be very aware of. And then I would push back a little bit against something that Allison said, because she said one of the problems is that the law is changing, and how do you then adapt to the changes? And I would say that the law is actually not changing nearly as much as the systems that we're looking at, and especially when you start talking about systems that have the potential to learn, like deep learning systems. And this is especially a problem with autonomous weapons systems, whether that be a pure software system or an embodied robotic autonomous weapon system. If there is this element of deep learning, and it is while it is being operationalized, so it's not frozen during operation, that system, that AI, that algorithm is changing. So at some point, it becomes a different algorithm than what has been reviewed and regulated for or governed or whatever when it was operationalized. So maybe at the point of operationalization, it was okay and it was passed by an ethics board, but then the deep learning goes into effect. And at some point, it changes enough that it's not the same system anymore. And at what point do you stop it again and have to re-look at it? And that takes me to the last point, to the last question I guess I raised to everybody, is that we talk about this Uber regulation and the idea or the dream of, I guess, governance and some form of actual repercussions for these things that are not necessarily or do cause harm. But frankly, the parliamentarians that are creating the laws, they don't even understand how the internet works. Most of them can't even fathom like how these basic things work. And so if they're the policymakers, can't understand the internet, how can they possibly understand deep learning systems, which are considered black boxes in many, it's so I think there's huge problems with all of these things. And really the other, and I guess like a thought that I would leave everybody with in that discussion is that the use of armed drones for targeted killings, so piloted drones, was not a thing before 2001, essentially. So after September 11th, various governments started using drones, remotely piloted drones for targeted killings. And the approvals for those use cases had to go very high up in the United States, it had to go up to the president in order for them to do that. And so they were done at a very low level. But over the last 20 years, those approval authorities have gotten pushed down to lower and lower levels because our normative values have changed. That has become a common practice. So there are more targeted killings now than there were in 2001, and it has been a huge growth increase because of the normative values. There are no regulations at the international level, and there never will be, I don't think, for this use. but other than the international humanitarian law that is supposedly guiding the use of weapons in conflict. But and so if we don't have these regulations at the state level or the international level, the values, the normative values that are being applied to these things are changing as we use them. So the more we use the artificial intelligence, the more it changes what we think of it and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So I guess I just would leave that. And I think I raised a lot of questions. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. Allison, you wanted to add something?
Yes, sorry, that's quite interesting. A couple of things. When you say that as it used to go to the high level, it used to go very high, and then it's dropped down the levels to, you said the normative values have changed. So I'm just wondering, you know, by dropping down a level, how have the normative values changed? Why do you think that they've changed? And is it because it's this accountability issue, and also people with cited interest in making these decisions? So if it has to be the president wants to get voted back in again. So that is always the governing sort of thing in the back of your mind when you're trying to make the decisions. You know, you think if they wanted to do it because it's the right thing to do, they always have to offset with the politics. So that is one reason why they go up high. So I was quite interested to expand on that aspect as an example, because I find that really useful, and your comments on regulation are really useful. And I will then also just add a very little story. I have a good friend who's the MP on the select committee that dealt with Cambridge Analytica, and so he sort of very sort of led on the report and stuff. And when the Great Hack came out, the very first person you hear speaking is him, and so I said, "Oh, you've got to watch this. I'll show you it." I couldn't remember things like so he came around, and I got my Netflix up to try and show him the film The Great Hack. You've got to watch it, and I'm not telling him why he had to watch it. And his question was, "Your Netflix is different to my Netflix. Why is it different?" And this is because it's a recommendation algorithm. And he didn't know, and yet he was very involved in dealing with that hacking, you know, the hacking as well, and then the Cambridge Analytica, and he didn't know about Netflix and an algorithm. So I think that was a classic example of what you say, that you don't know how the internet works and everything else. So yes, anyway, so normative values, I was quite interested in how everything slipped down and why it slipped down as well.
Yeah, I think, okay, so the specific example is, I mean, I know the case of the United States quite well, but the use of armed drones first began in 2001, and I think there was very few in the single digits, and it really had to have presidential authority. But as it was steadily used over time, now that authority has been granted to what's called the combatant commander level. So it's a 4-star general, and they can then decide to permit, to authorize an armed drone strike to kill people. And that has been used at various combatant commands, so at the US Africa Command as well as US Central Command, so various places like Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Yemen. And so that's a very clear use case of the authorities being dropped down to a much lower level. That's skipping the Secretary of Defense, and it goes down to the actual combatant commander level. And there was an article that I read about that really lays it out quite well. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I can certainly search in my reference library and try to find it for you if you'd be interested in reading it. Because it discusses how that has progressed over time and how it has affected normative values. And what they mean by that, what the author was arguing, is that this idea of a targeted killing or the use of a remotely piloted drone is being allowed at a lower level, the authorization, meaning that it is more acceptable. It doesn't have to go up to the highest level in order to permit that use case, and that's where those values are changing. Whereas before, it would be abhorrent for a combatant commander to single-handedly decide to use an armed drone to target somebody in Somalia. Now it's common practice, and that's where that value calculation has changed. But again, I'm probably doing injustice to the paper. It's written very well, and I can certainly search for it and send it to you.
Sounds fascinating. I'd be very grateful.
Daniel. We can circulate it if others are interested as well to the participants, and if anybody gets in touch with us by email, we can circulate it wider.
But this brings back to the issue of accountability and who can be held responsible. If you're bringing that decision to a soldier who has different life experiences and drivers compared to a politician, compared to a lawyer, compared to, you know, a social scientist coming in, the fact that a singular person can make these decisions and they are of a very particular type of person, that is a concern.
But if I may, what the author was actually getting at is the idea of allowing a autonomous robotic system, or authorizing an autonomous robotic system the authority to make targeting decisions. So in other words, like right now, we say we want meaningful human control of a system that is capable of choosing targets, like it would need to be remotely piloted. But it's not a very difficult technological problem to allow a armed drone to target people without human in the loop. And that is the question. And then, and I would raise the issue when you start talking about artificial intelligence and pure algorithms, when you're operating at a faster pace than what a human can decide at between a offensive and a defensive action or a countermeasure, that's when it becomes extremely problematic. And there's multiple cases of cyber weapons being used that were really terrible. And actually, so I just found the article, I had it right here. It's called Norms or What Machines Make of Them, Autonomous Weapon Systems and the Normative Implications of Human-Machine Interactions. And it's from the University of Kent by an author named Hendrik Hules, Huelss.
Got it. Thank you. That is fun. That is so interesting. And of course, we can create any justifications as to what's offensive and defensive. Noel Sharkey will be having a fit at this if you know his work.
The other issue seems to me of relevance here is the fact that we also, again, in relation to how these normative spheres are placed in a different setup, let's say, by the developments that are already out in the real world, is that then we have, such as, for instance, UN, who is trying to catch up with putting a brake a bit on use of autonomous systems for killing purposes and with humans out of the loop and so on, is that we create a social context after which, without in a regulatory vacuum, after which we are running after it in order to catch up. And as I guess Daniel is suggesting a bit, it's more difficult to catch up and reverse something that has already been made acceptable, or at least a reality. And this has been taking place. Of course, now it's a very fast and technical pace. We have had this with the environment, with GMO crops and so on, that have become, to a great extent, a reality at which there was research a couple of years ago showing, I think, from a research project in Cambridge, showing, for instance, in relation to issues of privacy, that people have, to a great extent, lost not interest, but hope that one can reappropriate privacy, that the issues are so far gone with us being tracked online and through social media and through our mobile phones and so on, that there is in a way an acceptance due to the seen as inevitable, the process that has been taking place, and which means we don't have hope for reclaiming our rights, for instance, in this particular case. And yes, so any other issues that, well, there is so much, it seems, really. I think that from everything that is under the umbrella of this symposium, to which I I would encourage everybody to stay in touch and keep we have started about 4 years ago, part of the AISB, and with this I take the opportunity really to express my thanks to the AISB for really implementing this wisdom that us working together is making a home for the AIRoNOS symposium within the AISB. Emphasizing this realization that we do need to stay in conversation, which is the theme for this year, actually. Conversation and communication about these issues, because we do have, as Allison indicated, different life experiences, but also we live in this fairly closed bubbles, normative bubbles, because it's not that artificial intelligence needs law to come to it. Artificial intelligence and technology has its own rules, what it matters, what reality it creates. However, we do need to exchange, to find common language, or at least to reach to understand each other's language. When initially the first time I attended the AISB, that was when the guiding principles, I think, for EPSRC in UK were emerged for artificial intelligence. I remember to a great extent also attending a symposium, parallel symposium sessions, speaking about embodied cognition and embodied learning. And throughout the session until the very end, I thought that it was used in a metaphorical way, which in fact is not at all. It does speak about, afterwards I learned, yeah, it speaks about indeed trying to make artificial intelligence, robotic systems that learn through embodiment, through functions such as ours would have, or maybe others as well. So we do need, this brings me to, we do need to learn about each other's language, and not to think, as I thought at the beginning, that everything is kind of metaphorically used in the field, so to speak. And then this relates also to the, I think, to the technology, if we can bring this umbrella, technology people learning about the terminology that is used in other spheres, such as governance, such as regulatory terminology. Why? Because what it may be due diligence as the meaning that is constructed in law, for instance, or duty of care, it may not be something that is an immediate, it can turn into a very technical meaning, which means, again, we need to conversate about what this is. Because if we delegate, as one comment said earlier, who are the regulators and who are the regulated, and we have the engineers becoming the regulators, it means that that class of people, that category of stakeholders, need to become conversant in human rights and in legal terminology to understand, for the benefit of the technology laboratories, as well as for the benefit of society, what we mean by due diligence, for instance, or such expressions. Yeah. So any other issue that I can see some comments here. Thank you, Allison. An article you posted, norms are what machines make. Daniel, okay, all right, thank you.
Link to Daniel's one. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I think I will save the chat and go back to it later, and I look forward to read that paper. Indeed. So
I have let the dog in from the garden, just so that you know.
That's very kind to let us know. It's a bit nippy outside, so yes. So I think the parallel session may have been discussing about anthropomorphization and how we engage with artificial intelligence and robotics. That would be one advantage but only one, and maybe not that you wouldn't need to let the dog out if it was a.
Sorry, apologies, but she's got this habit. I mean, yeah. I do like the fact, Aurora, that we do this at the end of these symposiums because, and thank you for everybody who jumped in on the conversation. This happened almost by accident, didn't it? With one session, we were in Falmouth University, and it was very hard for people to get to and stuff. And we just opened the floor, and then people started, and it was, when it was in person, and this has been quite good with Zoom. It's hard to do by Zoom. So I wondered how it would go, but when it's in person, people wandered in and we were just sat around and we just had a chance to chat, share ideas, share thoughts with no, big experts on panels or anything like that. And we were just all around, and it was probably one of the better sessions of the day, to be truthful. And it was really valuable. So I'm glad we're still doing it. And I do believe it's inclusive because, encouraged everybody to speak. If you can use chat or pop up, and I'm very grateful for that you still ran it.
Yes. Thank you very much, Allison, and thank you to Allison as well for agreeing to not co-chair, or what an unconference may have as. Indeed, we thought it was a great opportunity to also to cover a bit, because in the call for papers, those of you that have seen it, we have really mentioned a great number of topics and areas that are under the umbrella of the AIRoNOS symposium, and we cannot possibly cover all in one day. Of course, we could consider having a 2-day, but that would be rather tiring, I think, for online engagement. Already very wisely, the convention organizers have decided to have half days rather than full days. Nevertheless, we look forward to hopefully seeing you to the next AIRoNOS 2022 live in some wonderful or grubby, it doesn't matter what kind of place it can be, or we just re-engaging physically, embodied engagement, not metaphorically. And so thank you all for taking part today throughout the sessions, to the presenters and to the ones that contributed. And last but not least, thank you again to the convention organizers for embracing us and keeping us from one year to the other to bring these issues and raise awareness and also communicate among ourselves.
And thank you, Aurora, because I know how much work this takes, and you take a lot of it on. So thank you. You've done a fantastic job.
Surprisingly, although this was to a great extent transferred from last year, there was still, but this is why I appreciate also, and I'm speaking about the convention organizers, because they converted. I also know that Yasmin, the main convention organizer, really, you know how it is when we plan an important event, we plan it for a particular year, and then everything was transferred a year later with a lot more work. Everything was, so it was really great that we had the opportunity to do it, even in this format. So thank you all for contributing. And we take a brief break, and we can meet for the plenary talk. That is Professor Sophie Scott from Institute of Cognition Neuroscience in a few minutes. Yes, in 10 minutes. Yes.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.